This is Duke University.
Let's get started. We have only about an hour. I want to make the best use of our time. I'm Richard Newell. I'm the director of the Duke University Energy Initiative, and I'm a faculty member at the Nicholas School of the Environment. Welcome to our Energy Speaker Series. Particular presentation by Michael Byers on who owns the Arctic's oil. I'll come back to that in a moment. For more information on the Energy Initiative, if you're curious, you can go to our website, www.energy.duke.edu, and see what we're doing in the areas of education, research, and engagement in the energy space at Duke, and you can sign up for our email list. I want to thank Stephen Kelly and the Duke Center for Canadian Studies for co-sponsoring this particular event and for inviting Michael Byers to join us today. Michael Byers holds the Canada Research Chair in Global Politics and International Law at the University of British Columbia. Prior to 2005, he was a professor of law and director of Canadian Studies at Duke University, so we're really thrilled to have him back joining us today. He's a regular contributor to the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the Ottawa Citizen, and a frequent guest on a number of different Canadian TV programs. His most recent book is entitled Who Owns the Arctic, which is also the title of a joint University of North Carolina Duke conference, which will be held tomorrow on the UNC campus. And if you're interested in attending that conference, please go to arcticuncduke.com. Without further ado, I want to welcome, or please join me in welcoming Michael Byers to our speaker series. And I think Michael's going to speak for...
not very long.
20 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion, questions, and answers.
Yes, thank you. There are a couple of seats up here at the front. So, guys, come on in. Don't be shy. Well, it's great to be back at Duke. When I left Duke in 2004 and returned home to Canada after 12 years of absence, I thought I should start working on an issue that was somewhat Canadian. My work beforehand had focused on global issues relating to international law and politics, including the use of military force and international law. But I thought, well, I'm going home to Canada, and well, maybe there's an issue there that would be suitable for someone coming home. And I stumbled on the Northwest Passage as an issue that concerned the United States and Canada, that concerned climate change, that concerned Indigenous peoples, that concerned the law of the sea, and started to work on that as a side Canadian project. And quickly discovered that first of all, that the Arctic became all-consuming because it's a big and very complicated, fascinating, interdisciplinary subject, the kind of stuff I like, but also that the Arctic was becoming much more than a Canadian issue, that the Arctic was becoming a global issue, and increasingly a global issue of real salience in terms of diplomacy, in terms of media coverage, and that my particular background was very useful to actually being a constructive expert voice advisor on this field. So what you're getting here is kind of my post-Duke persona, but everything that went into this was built at Duke, and so it's nice to come back and speak to these issues. I hope everyone can see this map. It's a somewhat unusual perspective on the world, but of course there is no one perspective that's more legitimate than any other, because the Earth is a sphere floating in space. There's no up or down or sideways. So this view, looking down on the North Pole, is just as legitimate as any other. And you see a little bit of the politics of the region through this as well. Now, I took this map off of the CIA website so that I could say with no hint of sarcasm that the size of the font that is used for the different country names is actually reflective of the relative importance of the different countries in the Arctic. Okay. First of all, you have Russia, right? The world's largest country geographically. Obviously, until 2 decades ago, the Soviet Union, the West's adversary in the Cold War, a very significant geopolitical force to this day, not least because it is a still very significant nuclear weapon armed state. It is also economically very important today as the largest supplier of energy for Europe, particularly Western Europe. It is now more or less integrated into the global economy. Russia was just in the last month or so admitted to the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And Russia, we hear a lot of talk about how Russia is in collapse or how Russia has become corrupt and dysfunctional. And there is, of course, some truth to that. But when you visit Russia, as I do on a regular basis, you are still struck by the significance of the place. So for instance, in November, I was a visiting professor at the University of Novosibirsk, which none of you have ever heard of. Novosibirsk is in south-central Siberia. It's a city of 1.5 million people. It has a science park with 100,000 scientists and technicians because the Soviet Union moved a lot of its science away from its borders for security reasons. And it is the major hub on the Trans-Siberian Railway, which has now become a principal route for transporting natural resources from Russia to China. And I just watched train after train after train of resources heading south east towards that economic power, that consumer market of energy, of minerals, of wood. So a place you've never heard of, right? But very much a dynamic part of the contemporary world. Russia is and will remain a very important country for all of us, and it will remain an important country because of its proximity, among other things, to North America. And we're not talking about huge distances here. From northernmost Franz Josef Land, this northernmost islands here, to the North Pole is around 650 miles, and it's about another 650 miles to get to Canadian territory. And of course, on the other side, in the Bering Strait between Alaska and the far east of Russia, the distance is only 42 miles. So there's proximity at work. The second most significant Arctic country is Canada. Also happens to be the second largest country in the world, geographically. Canada, a member of NATO, a very important country in terms of its physical location during the Cold War. If an intercontinental ballistic missile were fired from the Soviet Union to the United States, it would necessarily cross over the Canadian Arctic. And so there were very major deployments, not just of US forces, but also of Canadian forces to the Arctic during that period. There was also a lot of activity by Russians in Canadian waters during the Cold War. I was on a Russian-flagged, ice-strengthened cruise ship last summer in the Northwest Passage. And this Russian-flagged ship had the old Soviet navigational charts. And so I'm looking at the Northwest Passage on the old Soviet chart beside a new Canadian one, and I noticed that the Soviet chart is much, much better than the Canadian one. And I subsequently asked a colleague of mine who was in the Soviet diplomatic corps about this, and he laughed and said, well, yeah, it was a major sphere of operations for our submarines. This is within North America, the Northwest Passage. So Canada was very much a part of the Cold War in that and other senses. Canada, of course, remains, despite the rise of China, remains the United States' most important trading partner. You can see why, because of geographic proximity, and also because of natural resources, whether it's uranium, whether it's oil, whether it's gas, whether it's wood, whether it's diamonds. Canada, as the second largest geographic space on Earth, right beside the United States, a very intense relationship, and so it remains significant in that regard. In terms of other countries of importance, the world's largest island that is not a continent in its own right is Greenland, which is very close to Canada, just roughly 20 miles away. Greenland, of course, belongs to Denmark, although Greenland has been given greater and greater autonomous governing powers, largely covered by ice. But the ice cap, as with the ice everywhere in the Arctic, is melting at a significant rate. Lots of interest in especially mineral wealth in Greenland, interest in oil and gas, particularly in this area here off western Greenland, a very significant presence. And indeed, I know the Danish ambassador to Canada, and he pointed out to me that being Danish ambassador to Canada is one of the 3 or 4 most prestigious positions for a Danish diplomat, because of this relationship here. There are some other Arctic countries, Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Iceland, but of course the other significant country is the United States. Don't think that many Americans think of themselves as an Arctic nation. And well, you weren't before 1867, when you purchased Alaska from Russia. But certainly a major Arctic presence. Think back to the Cold War, think about the deployment of missile defense interceptors in Alaska today. Think about the fact that there are F-22 fighter jets based near Anchorage. Think about the importance of Alaskan oil and gas to the United States, particularly the development of the North Slope. And think also about the general interest in security issues from a U.S. perspective. Again, if we're talking about something like the Northwest Passage, we're talking about the northern flank of North America. And so you get those concerns relating back to the United States as well. Another thing just to mention, it's obvious from this map, the Arctic is very unlike the Antarctic. The Antarctic is a continent surrounded by oceans. The Arctic is an ocean surrounded by continents. So a lot of the issues that concern the Arctic actually are maritime issues, not land issues. And that's something that will become increasingly important. Now, in terms of a lawyer's perspective on this, it's interesting that there's only one dispute over land in the entire Arctic, this region that's measured in thousands of miles. And the one disputed piece of land is right here. It's only half a mile across. And it sits exactly on the maritime boundary between Canada and Greenland. And we didn't know that we had a dispute until we were actually delimiting, negotiating that boundary in 1973. And the negotiators, all of a sudden, as they were drawing this line, got here and they looked at each other and said, well, who owns this? And the other guy said, well, it doesn't really matter because we don't have a mandate to delimit land. So you know what they did? Whoops, sorry. They just drew the boundary up to the low water mark on the south side, and went back and continued it from the north side. And they said, well, we'll go and get a mandate, and we'll come back and we'll do this next year. Right? But while they paused on Hans Island, Canadian and Danish politicians found out. And went, whoa, this is great. A sovereignty dispute over an inconsequential rock with a very close ally. Right? I mean, Canada and Denmark are very close friends. Not only are we partners in NATO, not only are we negotiating a free trade agreement with them right now, but Canada imports millions and millions of Lego blocks each year. This is a good relationship, and so it's a risk-free sovereignty dispute, right? And so now, ever since this dispute arose, shortly before a Canadian election, a Canadian politician will fly to Hans Island on a helicopter and raise a Canadian flag. Okay? And anytime there's a Danish election, a Danish politician will fly there and raise a Danish flag. And each side knows what's going on, right? They are deliberately tapping into their population's concerns about Arctic sovereignty, almost entirely misplaced concerns about Arctic sovereignty, right? You get to beat their chest and say, we're standing up for Denmark, or we're standing up for Canada. But it's just about domestic politics. And they know this to the degree that anytime Canadians arrive here, they find a bottle of Danish schnapps in the cairn, in the rock. And anytime a Danish person arrives, they find a bottle of Canadian whiskey, right? It's called bottle diplomacy. And I simply tell you this story to illustrate that sometimes what you read in newspapers about the Arctic is up for grabs, or there's uncertain sovereignty, or there's a new Cold War. Well, sometimes that is actually there because it's of domestic electoral utility. And what actually is happening in the real diplomacy might be something completely different. Now, this particular dispute has been resolved by my 11-year-old son, who produced the following slide. So watch, look at this, and then I'll show you his solution. And it really is as easy as that. But of course, if we did this, then we would deprive ourselves of the electoral utility of the situation. The point here is that there are no disputes over land anywhere else in the Arctic, and so stuff that happens on land is not of concern diplomatically. So this is a mine development in northern Canada on Baffin Island. It's called the Mary River Mine. It's the largest and purest deposit of iron ore that has been discovered in the world. And it is now in its ramp-up phase. It's a $5 billion project, which, once it's operational in roughly 5 to 6 years, will see 13 purpose-built, ice-strengthened super ore carriers traveling 12 months a year between Baffin Island and Rotterdam, the Netherlands, because this steel is going to the foundries of the Ruhr district of Germany. And there's nothing of concern in terms of diplomacy whatsoever. This is absolute uncontested Canadian jurisdiction. It just so happens that the company that is doing this is an Indian-owned company. India, as opposed to North American India. An India-owned company, it's going to German foundries, and it's all a reflection of the fact that in terms of natural resources, we live in a global economy. This is foreign investment, but there's nothing of diplomatic concern. It is interesting also that the company has worked really hard to get local buy-in in terms of the local indigenous peoples, the Inuit, being assured many of the jobs at the development. And if someone's interested in talking about those kinds of relationships, I'd be happy to do so. So most of the issues concern maritime issues, whether it's shipping resources that might be produced on land, or shipping resources that are produced offshore, and issues concerning jurisdiction over offshore resources, and issues concerning the safety of transportation like this. The Arctic is a remote and inhospitable region. People in southern Canada or in the United States sometimes fail to realize just the distances involved, right? I can fly from here, from Raleigh-Durham, right, to Toronto in an hour, okay? To get from Toronto to Iqaluit, which is the capital of Nunavut, Canada's Northern Territory, is 3 hours. To get from Nunavut to the northernmost point of land in Canada, to get from Iqaluit to the northernmost point of land in Canada, is another 3 hours on a jet, okay? And then I'm still another couple of hours from the North Pole, right? So the distances are extreme. Add to that ice, and we're losing a lot of ice now in the summer, and because of climate change, it is foreseeable that we will lose all of the Arctic sea ice in the late summer within the next 5, 10, 15 years. But we will, for the foreseeable future, have ice in the winter and spring reforming and posing some serious challenges, because this first year ice can still get 3, 4, 5 feet thick and be pushed into very substantial ridges and be pushed across the surface of the ocean. So sea ice will remain a challenge. There are icebergs. In fact, there are more icebergs than they used to be, because climate change is causing the surface of the ice sheets, particularly on Greenland, to melt, and that meltwater is finding its way down to the bottom of the glaciers and lubricating their movement into the sea. You've all heard of the Titanic. You can spot big icebergs on radar now, but small icebergs, growlers, are still a real safety issue. There are extreme storms. I mean, last summer in August, I was it was only a gale in the eastern Beaufort Sea, and the swells were still 25 or 30 feet high, which wasn't a dangerous thing, but again, it was only a gale. And if something had gone wrong, we would have likely have had to wait 3, 4, 5 days before anyone would have come to our assistance. So these pose real challenges. Other things that happen is something called icing, where you get strong winds in the winter, where you might be on open water, but there's spray. And because the air temperature is well below freezing, the spray freezes on the superstructure of the ship. And as more and more spray forms on the superstructure, it destabilizes the vessel, and there's a risk of it being turned over. So all these things combine to make it an expensive place to operate safely. You can operate there safely, but it's expensive. And that's something when people talk about Arctic oil, Arctic gas, just think about expense that's associated with all of these different elements. It's not a place where you can expect to rush in and be competitive in terms of costs of exploration and extraction with other places quite yet. Now, there's been a lot of excitement over, again, who owns what, and this colleague of mine from the Russian Academy of Sciences, Artur Chilangerov, with the impressive facial hair, caused a real media stir in August of 2007 by doing something that was extraordinarily courageous. And he personally went in a submersible below moving sea ice at the North Pole, 12,000 feet down to the bottom, and planted a Russian titanium flag. And then said to the international media, "The Arctic is Russian." Now, remember what I said about domestic politics. Mr. Chilangerov was the deputy chair of the Russian Duma, the Russian parliament, at the time that he did this, and it was in the middle of an election campaign. The Russian foreign minister later dismissed this as, quote, a publicity stunt. And it got a lot of people excited because, oh my gosh, Russia's claiming the North Pole. Russia's not claiming the North Pole, no more than the United States claimed the moon when Neil Armstrong planted a flag there, okay? Because there are rules concerning who owns what. And Mr. Chilangerov knows that as well as anyone else. So when you look at the Arctic, let me just show you a couple of things. This is a map that I flipped over for reasons that will become obvious in a minute, that was produced by the US Geological Survey. Here's Greenland to situate you. Here's Baffin Island. Here's Norway. Alaska's up there. And this shows the US Geological Survey's guesstimations. Okay, can't call them much more than that. Guesstimations as to the probability of hydrocarbon reserves in the Arctic. It's not a great map. So a colleague of mine at the International Boundary Research Unit in Durham, England, has produced something that helps to elucidate what's going on. The darker the shade of pink, the higher the likelihood of oil and gas. So very high likelihoods of oil and gas off of the northern coast of Alaska, off of the Canadian portion of the Beaufort Sea. This is the Queen Elizabeth Islands. We know that there is in excess of $1 trillion worth of oil and gas there, although this is the most inhospitable part of the Arctic in terms of concentrations of sea ice, so we haven't gone anywhere near exploiting that. Look at the coast of Norway and Russia, and you get a sense as to where the distribution is. And then notice this dotted line. That dotted line is the 200 nautical mile limit. It's the exclusive economic zone, the EEZ. All of the dark pink is within 200 nautical miles of shore. Now the Russian line goes further offshore because of these Russian islands which generate EEZ. So all of the dark pink and most of any of the pink is within 200 nautical miles of shore. So this isn't a sovereignty issue in terms of the oil and gas. Most of it falls within the jurisdiction of one or another country. This is an issue of cost and environmental protection. And when you're talking about Russia, technology transfer, foreign investment, and also, I guess, to some degree, the other countries also. We'll put up another map which shows national jurisdictions. And I want to just show you a couple of things here. That red line on the top is the US-Russia boundary. I'll talk about that in a moment. This line down here is the Russian and Norwegian boundary, both settled, negotiated by treaty. Here's the boundary between Greenland and Canada, also negotiated by treaty. That little island is right in here. So as you see, even the fence lines between the adjoining properties, most of them have been settled. And then as you move out, beyond this 200 nautical miles, you see that light green area off of Russia. And it is allowable under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea for countries to claim rights to seabed jurisdiction beyond 200 nautical miles from shore, but only in circumstances where they can demonstrate geologically and geomorphologically, the actual nature of the rock and the shape of the ocean floor, that the seabed in any area is a so-called natural prolongation of the continental shelf. And Russia filed a claim to that light green area back in 2002 to a body of scientists at the United Nations, the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, was told to go back and do more science. It's a legal process which is science-based. And although the United States has not yet ratified the Law of the Sea Convention, the US government is treating these provisions as if they were binding, either because they intend to ratify, and both the Bush administration and now the Obama administration intend to at some point ratify when they can get advice and consent from the Senate. But they're also essentially working as if these were the rules that the US wants to use, because they're actually good for every country. And there's a possibility of maybe some small overlaps in the central Arctic Ocean, but Canada Russia and Denmark are cooperating very closely with respect to that issue. So again, on maritime boundary disputes, you've never heard of an Arctic sovereignty dispute between Russia and the United States because there isn't one. Because in 1990, the State Department seized the opportunity of the declining power of the Soviet Union and glasnost to negotiate a whole bunch of things, including this maritime boundary. And it's quite an extraordinary achievement in that it has regulated what could have been a fairly tense situation, particularly in terms of fisheries. I mean, there may well be hydrocarbons in this area also, but the big thing here was to resolve the potential for fisheries disputes. And the US Senate gave advice and consent for ratification very quickly. Here, the Russian Duma held off, and so the two countries essentially did an executive agreement on the side to say that until such time as the Duma ratified this, the two countries would treat it as binding. And that remains the situation now, 22 years later. Not a problem for either country. And then I've already mentioned in the Barents Sea, very significant development last year. Russia, okay, nuclear-armed, former superpower, negotiating a boundary treaty with Norway, population 5 million. NATO country, right? Population 5 million. And they not only negotiated a boundary, they agreed to split the difference in that they divided the disputed sector exactly in half. It was a huge disputed sector, area of considerable importance for fisheries, significant hydrocarbons, and they did this deal. And they were able to do this deal because they recognized that doing this deal would actually open up the area to oil and gas exploration because, guess what? Companies will not drill in contested waters because the risk is too high. Okay? Oil and gas companies won't go anywhere near a disputed zone because the risk of not having a good permit or having your exploration then tied up in a political dispute is a very significant deterrent. So the oil companies want legal certainty. And today, when dealing with Russia, the fact of the matter is that Russia wants Western capital and Western technology to develop its Arctic oil and gas. I've heard Vladimir Putin say as much. I've actually heard Putin say that he supports international cooperation in the Arctic because if you stand alone in the Arctic, you do not survive. And I've heard one of Putin's deputy ministers say that they've calculated that without Western capital and technology, they will develop their Arctic oil and gas at a certain rate. With Western capital and technology, the rate will be, and listen to this, the rate will be 4 times higher. And given that 20% of Russia's GDP is dependent now on Arctic resources, this is a very big deal for them. It is the incentive, the principal, perhaps almost the only incentive for Russian cooperation in the Arctic, but it's very, very real. And so as a result of this agreement, Statoil, which is the big Norwegian oil company, is now in a joint venture with, I think it's Gazprom, big Russian company, over the Stockman natural gas field, which is one of the largest natural gas fields in the world, right in here. So legal certainty of interest to companies, cooperation in terms of investment and technology, a big, big driver for everything that's going on. Now, there is a dispute between Canada and the United States in the Beaufort Sea, just to the north of Alaska and the Yukon Territory. This is the way the dispute looked for decades. We discovered we had a dispute in 1970 when Canada adopted a fishery zone offshore, and then the United States did also, and we had different lines for our fishery zones. And it goes back to different interpretations of a treaty from 1825. The treaty is between Russia and Great Britain. Because in 1825, Russia owned Alaska, and well, Dominion of Canada had not yet been constituted. So it was British. on the eastern side of this boundary, and they drew this treaty delimiting the land border. And the treaty says it's the 141st West Meridian, quote, as far as the frozen ocean, end quote. And then the Russians sold it, and Britain gave Canada independence. Nice little problem they were handing over, right? Because they didn't really say anything explicit about what happened offshore. Now, Canadian lawyers, for some strange reason, think that as far as the frozen ocean means into and out further towards the North Pole. That the 141st meridian is the maritime boundary. That as far as the frozen ocean should be interpreted as continuing into the frozen ocean. And they've marshaled a bunch of legal arguments, some of which are not bad and some of which are baloney. And for example, one of the arguments is that on the other side, similar language was used to delimit a maritime boundary later on between the US and Russia. The United States position has always been that as far as the frozen ocean means that the line stops at the frozen ocean. And from that point onwards, the default rule of international law takes over, which is an equidistance line. Not a perpendicular line, but a line that at every point is an equal distance from the coast on both sides. So it goes out in this direction because the coastline slopes in a general sort of north-northwest to southeast-east kind of direction here. And this line goes out like this, creating a 6,250 square mile disputed zone. And for the last 4 decades, the two countries have simply agreed to disagree because there wasn't any commercial fishing in the Beaufort Sea. And the oil and gas companies had lots of area over here, uncontested Canadian or American, in which they could do their thing if they wanted to. And there was some exploration over in here, and there's some exploration over in here. And this was essentially a, well, nature reserve, right? Now, a couple things have conspired to change the situation. One is that the oil companies have become more interested in this region as oil and gas, well, oil prices trend up and gas prices trended up for a while and then they trended down. Partly because the sea ice is melting, so this region is becoming more accessible. Right? And for those reasons, this dispute seemed to be something that might actually have developed into a problem between the two countries. Until, coincidentally, something quite fortuitous occurred. You remember I was talking about that possibility of claiming rights more than 200 miles offshore, under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, claiming extended continental shelves based on the shape and the geology of the ocean floor. Well, for the last 5 years, Canada and the United States have been cooperating north of that disputed sector to map the ocean floor for the purposes of developing submissions for a Canadian extended continental shelf and beside it an American extended continental shelf. And they've been cooperating for a very practical reason. They only have one heavy icebreaker each available in the Arctic. And it takes 2 to do this work. Because if you're collecting seismic data, right, from a ship that is breaking ice at the same time, the front end of the ship is vibrating like crazy as you're breaking through the ice, which completely distorts your data collection at the back of the ship. And if you're doing bathymetry, if you're doing sonar, if you're mapping the shape of the ocean floor, you have similar challenges because this is all based on bouncing sound signals, right, off of the ocean floor. And ice breaking is not conducive to this. So what you need is you need to have 2 icebreakers. The first one breaks the ice, the second one tucks in behind and collects the data. So the Healy collects the bathymetry, so the US Coast Guard does the shape, and the Louis S. Saint Laurent does the seismology. And then when it's time to switch the data collection, they switch places. And we've been, for the last 5 years, doing this together way, way north. Last year they got to 88 degrees north, which is almost the North Pole, working together in this way, and they get fabulous science. So these are multi-beam sonar tracks off of the Healy, and this is off the Chukchi Plateau. So this is near where Shell wants to drill a couple of wells, sort of much closer inshore. But this is off of that area, and this Chukchi Plateau juts out. And until Canada and the United States started the joint mapping, the United States thought that the end of its continental shelf, its extended continental shelf, was right here. They thought that this obviously was where the geomorphology changed, right? Where you went from continental shelf to deep ocean floor, right here. But because they've been able to go out there and map with these highly sensitive instruments, they now realize that the extent of the US claim is going to be out here. That this is actually what's called the foot of the slope. And so the US will actually be able to claim all this area in here only because of this cooperation between the two countries. And then we're talking, just so you know, we're talking about several 100,000 square miles, right? That's going to be added to US jurisdiction as a result of international cooperation. I think that's pretty exciting. The other thing that's happened because of this is that a retired State Department lawyer named Ashley Roach, who's a good friend and colleague of mine, suggested to me a couple of years ago that the existence of rights beyond 200 nautical miles had an impact on the legal dispute as to the boundary. I should have realized this myself, but sometimes you get stuck in ruts and you don't necessarily think outside of them in new circumstances. And Ash Roach encouraged me to get a map commissioned that would show what happens to the Canadian and US legal positions if you extend the lines further offshore, more than 200 nautical miles. And this map was produced by Coulter Lathrop, who has both a Duke BA and a Duke JD, and runs a company in Asheville called Sovereign Geographic. He does maritime mapping and represents countries in front of the International Court of Justice. And he did this map for me for free. He probably wishes he hadn't done it for free now because it's been reproduced around the world. But it shows you what happens. The Canadian line, of course, keeps going straight north because we say it's the meridian is as far as the North Pole, straight north. But the American line is an equidistance line. And there's this great big honkin' island over here called Banks Island, Canadian Island. And this will give you a sense of the scale of the Arctic. Banks Island, and you can see 90% of it here, is larger than the United Kingdom. Okay? Big, big spaces up here. Look what Banks Island does to the equidistance line. It turns, heads out north-northwest, crosses the Canadian line, and heads out towards, oh my gosh, the US-Russian boundary. And essentially creates two, well, disputed areas. One on the Canadian side of the Canadian line, and the other on the US side of the Canadian line. I took this map. The moment that Coulter sent me this map, I flew to Ottawa and I showed it to the Canadian Foreign Minister, our Secretary of State, who I was advising on Arctic issues, despite the fact that he and I are from very different political parties. I showed him this map, and this big smile went across his face. A huge smile. He's a politician. What do politicians do? They negotiate, they compromise, right? They cut deals. Right? He didn't know all that much about the Arctic, but he knew a win-win negotiating situation when he saw one, right? You could not write a better story, a better fictional story about how do you get from a zero-sum game to a win-win on a boundary. It just happened, right? And as a result of this map, Canada and the United States have been in discussions on this boundary ever since. In fact, Lawrence Cannon, the then foreign minister, came to Washington and made a public invitation to open negotiations. The negotiations have not yet concluded because we haven't finalized the science further out. The 2 icebreakers are going back this summer because we need to know how far out our rights go before we can actually decide where we want to draw our line, our combined agreed line. It doesn't need to follow one or the other of these lines. It could go right up the middle and split the difference, or it could wiggle around here or there. And guess what? We also want to know where the hydrocarbons are, right? So we're doing some interesting seismic work in here that's now aimed at finding out what are the probabilities for the purposes of a negotiated line. And there's a general recognition that we want to get this done fairly soon before the price of oil goes higher, before the immediate stakes escalate. This is a good time to do this. Oil and gas is still, well, Arctic oil and gas is still prohibitively expensive. There's a little bit of exploration taking place in here and in here, but for the most part, we're talking about the future. We're talking about 10, 20, 50 years down the line. This is a good time to sort it out, provide the legal certainty that the companies need. And I'm optimistic that we'll get there in the next couple of years. And here's, just so you can see, the speech that Mr. Cannon gave in Washington. And notice how he starts this. I was struck recently by the fact that Russia and Norway resolved a long-standing dispute in the Arctic. What happens in one place creates, in some cases, a positive domino effect elsewhere. And while there are still some uncertainties, I believe that should not keep our 2 nations from resolving that dispute. This is in the Beaufort and moving forward with current issues. It's made easier also by the fact that Canada and the United States are in NAFTA, and Chapter 6 of NAFTA is on energy. And because we have a common energy market, wherever we put the line, it could just as likely be a US company drilling on the Canadian side or a Canadian company drilling on the American side. The pipeline that might carry that oil south could just as easily go through Canada as it goes through the United States. This all makes it much, much easier. This isn't really about wealth procurement from the Arctic. This is about sorting out a fence line dispute that could cause some frictions in the future and certainly doesn't need to cause any now. I'm going to leave the next issue for discussion. Obviously, if we're talking about Arctic oil and gas, and there is Arctic oil and gas development in other places in the Arctic already, like off of the west coast of Greenland or north of Russia, environmental concerns become very prominent. These 2 birds were killed by the Exxon Valdez, right? A spill in the Arctic would be magnitudes more damaging than the spill off of the southwest coast of Alaska. For 2 simple reasons. Most important reason is that oil degrades and dissipates very, very slowly in cold water. And the water in the Arctic is very cold indeed. Okay? I have actually sailed in a ship on open water that was minus 1.5 degrees Celsius because it's salt water, right? There's not a whole lot of bacterial action taking place in water that cold. So unlike in the Gulf of Mexico, where the bacteria were probably doing a bigger job towards dealing with the BP spill than anything else, that simply wouldn't be present in the Arctic, right? You add in the complicating fact of sea ice, certainly during the fall, winter, and spring. You add in the remoteness of the region. I mean, along the Gulf of Mexico, you have thousands of workers available almost immediately. You're not going to have thousands of workers or ships available along the northern coast of Alaska or the northern coast of Canada. This becomes a really, really scary prospect. And we can talk about how you might allow Arctic oil and gas in ways that would significantly reduce that risk. And I know that some of you will want to talk about that, so we'll leave that to questions. The last thing to say is that the Arctic is, of course, a stunningly beautiful place. If you haven't been, you should go. If you ever doubted the reality of climate change, going to the Arctic will solve that problem for you. Your doubt will disappear. If you've ever just ever failed to understand how shades of gray can be extraordinarily beautiful, just take a look at this. This picture, by the way, was taken at midnight. It's the land of the midnight sun. Or in the wintertime, the land of months and months of total darkness. It's a harsh place. It's a beautiful place. There will be increased economic activity in the Arctic, of that I have no doubt. And of course, that's all happening because of a very significant environmental change, namely climate change, that we also need to slow and then stop. But I know you want to talk about oil spills, so let's go there. Questions, comments? Yes, please.
So this isn't about oil spill, and you mentioned that we have very few boats that have access or can access the ice throughout the year. I know that Stephen Harper has talked about expanding the Canadian naval presence in the Arctic. I know there's been a lot of posturing about putting more military infrastructure in the area. I was wondering what the status of military investment in the Arctic is right now.
Yeah. There's very little military investment in the Arctic. Just to give you one example, Stephen Harper, the Canadian Prime Minister, promised 5 years ago to build a naval base at Nanisivik on northern Baffin Island. We found out last week through an access to information request that base is not actually going to be built. It's going to be used as a seasonal refueling facility without any renovations to the existing wharf and with no accommodation structures being built for anyone. Again, electoral politics driving a lot of this. The Prime Minister has promised to build 6 ice-strengthened naval vessels that can be used in the Arctic in the summertime. If you're interested in that, I've actually got a piece in today's Globe and Mail. So go on the Globe and Mail website, you'll find a piece that if I recall, is entitled, because editors always add their own titles, icebreakers are there's no replacement for real icebreakers. And that goes to the question as to what about the Canadian Coast Guard and the fact that it's an entirely civilian body, and can a civilian agency that is currently unarmed take care of the needs in the north? In my view, they can, because there is actually no threat from other states. Russia just joined the WTO, right? The threat such that it exists is from non-state actors, smugglers, rogue ships going in without sufficient safety standards. And that can be dealt with by a civilian agency. Yes, please.
One of the other problems associated with climate change is permafrost degradation, and so I guess that brings about 2 questions. The first is, with larger sea expanses, you get more waves from actually eroding coastlines. So question number 1 is, will that bring some of the 200-mile EEZs into conflict, or is it just small change? And question number 2 is, how will that affect oil and gas companies' kind of infrastructural investment costs in the ability to get natural gas out of the Arctic?
Yeah, well, let me deal with the last question first. I'm not an expert in pipeline construction and maintenance, but I have heard that melting permafrost poses real problems because essentially it's undermining the land on which the pipeline is built, right? So the melting and the heaving can cause real problems, and that changes the cost equation for choosing pipelines over shipping as a means of getting resources out. I, for instance, don't think that a natural gas pipeline will ever be built down the Mackenzie Valley, partly because of permafrost melt and partly because of the sea ice disappearing from the Beaufort, which raises the prospect of LNG tankers taking the Mackenzie Delta gas from land out to markets in South Korea or elsewhere. So yeah, pipelines and permafrost don't seem to go together, melting permafrost. On the first question, it's a question that I would spend an hour teasing international law students with. But the practical reality is that that sea level rise is unlikely to change the outer limit of the EEZ very much, very quickly. So you might be talking about potentially a few feet each year on average, which in the scale of 200 nautical miles is pretty insignificant. The teasing question for the law students would be, at what point can you actually set the outer limit and then have it stay there, despite the receding question? It's the same kind of question as to whether an island like Tuvalu can still have an EEZ after Tuvalu is submerged. Pretty grim questions when you think about it. But yeah, the permafrost melt is also something that needs to be highlighted in terms of its climate change consequences, because the Arctic tundra is made up of essentially organic material. It's peat, many feet deep. And when the permafrost melts, that organic material decomposes anorexically without oxygen, producing methane, which is 22 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. So if you want to get really, really frightened about climate change, read up on decomposing permafrost and also melting methyl hydrates, frozen natural gas on the ocean floor, and you can get very scared very quickly. Anyone who thinks that we actually have, time to delay serious action on climate change, yeah, you might want to take your seatbelt off and drive the wrong way down the freeway. I don't like the risks involved of waiting. Yeah.
It seems like we're in a negative feedback loop. Okay, I know about the melting ice kind of creates a quicker melting of ice. I've heard about this, but as the ice melts, we have more opportunity to develop more hydrocarbon fuel, which then comes back into the atmosphere and then speeds up the process even more. And at some point there will be a tipping point, obviously, and none of us know where that is, but how do you frame all of that in the social, political, economic?
Yeah. Well, the easy answer to that is that with regards to fossil fuels, we need to quote, internalize the externalities, and the externalities include the climate impact of fossil fuels, which is why we need to have carbon pricing, but they also they include the risk of oil spills and the costs, both the immediate economic costs and then the larger costs of such accidents. I've got a very simple response for Arctic oil and gas, and that is that we not have any liability caps with respect to spills. In the Canadian Arctic right now, we have a liability cap of just $40 million for a spill, which, I mean, how many seconds worth of profit for BP or Shell is that? I mean, it's insignificant. The reason is that liability cap was set back in 1970, right? Take away the liability cap. Okay, guys, you want to drill in the Chukchi Sea or the Beaufort Sea or the Queen Elizabeth Islands, well, you better do so safely, because if you don't, and you have a spill, you're going to be bankrupt. It's game over for your company, right? I mean, those kinds of incentives are very powerful indeed. And in my view, if we were to fully internalize the externalities of oil and gas, there wouldn't be any cost argument for companies going to the Arctic. You don't need to have a moratorium. You don't need to have particularly onerous regulations. You just say, look, guys, you're assuming a massive liability risk, and watch them back off, right? And if you internalize all the externalities, also you're providing a powerful incentive to develop alternative sources of energy, right? Which is obviously where we need to go, but you accelerate that move to alternative energy and get that happening much more quickly right now.
Okay.
what's the political will for having something like that happen, having that liability cap? I mean, it seems like something that would really go through.
I'm in a really good mood this week because because the last 7 months I've co-chaired the equivalent of a primary campaign for a political leader in Canada, a man named Thomas Mulcair, who was just elected leader of our main opposition party, the New Democrats. And the reason that I have spent 7 months trying to get him elected as our candidate for the federal election in 3 years is because he is such a demonstrated environmentalist. In fact, a number of years ago, he was the environment minister of the province of Quebec, and he resigned his cabinet post on environmental principle because he was told by his leader to look the other way while developers built condos in a park. He said, no, I won't sign that order. I'm out of here. And he was elected as the leader of our party on Saturday on a platform that included full internalization of the external costs for the tar sands in Alberta. Now, I don't know what will happen in 3 years' time, but he not only said that during the campaign, he said that during his victory speech. All right? So I'm hopeful that Canada will go from being one of the worst countries with respect to climate change and environmental regulation, which it is right now, to actually being a constructive partner in the years ahead. And I'm looking forward to being at that first meeting between Thomas Mulcair and Barack Obama in 3 years' time, when your president will have the luxury of a second term where he can do what he knows needs to be done.
I know Michael has a few minutes to stay afterward if people have some follow-up questions, but let's give a great
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.